Hello, welcome back to NonCompete. I'm EJ. Tonight's topic, debate. With me, as sometimes, the Slopstash.
What is debate?
Debate is when two people argue with each other.
I think we did it. We wrapped.
That's a very good bourgeois metaphysical definition of debate, but I want to dig deeper. I want to have a dialectical materialist.
Okay, gotcha.
And now, sit your ass back down, Slop.
Well, I thought, I said we were done, and then I thought
you need to saddle up, because today we are looking at debate through the lens of dialectical materialism, using the principles established in this book as a guide. This is the curriculum that Luna Oi translated. I helped out a little bit. Slop has a copy. Avid fan of the book, reading it right now for pleasure. This is the worldview and philosophical methodology of dialectical materialism. It's the Vietnamese curriculum on this universal philosophical framework. You don't have to have read this book to watch this video. Of course, we will make it easy for you to understand, teach you a little bit about Marxist philosophy. But if you do want to read this book, it's a really fantastic intro to Marxist thought, and you can get it for free at bannionhouse.org/shop. You can also buy the print copy if you want to support us, or you can just download the free ebook and print it out on your own printer if you want. We don't really care. We are going to talk about debate tonight, and debate is a big topic for people who are into politics on the internet and people who are into electoral politics, the two worst forms of politics. But I guess we could start by saying that, a bourgeois metaphysical definition would categorize debate as basically one static concept, which is to say two sides duking it out in the free market of ideas. But in truth, this concept of debate manifests in various ways, and it changes over time. Remember, in dialectical materialism, we define things by relationships, internal and external relationships. So we need to look at how debate relates to human beings and human societies and how it changes over time. Because in dialectical materialism, we consider all things, phenomena, and ideas to be constantly changing and developing through contradiction.
Are you suggesting that debate is different than it was so very long ago, and that it may be different in the future?
Indeed. I will not debate you on that point. That is what I suggested. And in fact, let's look at two different forms of debate, just to show that debate is not this monolithic metaphysical category, but it's actually an umbrella of a lot of different phenomena that interact with a lot of different aspects of human society. There's academic, high school and college debate, which, Slopstash, you and I actually met through debate tournaments when we were whippersnappers back in high school.
Right.
You could compare that to a presidential debate that we just had with Trump versus Biden, and which we're about to have at the time of this recording, presumably another one between Harris and Trump. That's going to be a nice spectacle. But obviously a presidential debate and the way that that's formatted, the purpose, the audience, all those things, very different. I would say essentially different from high school policy debate.
Right. Different overall character and different outcomes expected.
Most importantly, as we would define things through dialectical materialism, different relationships involved, different internal and external relationships. For instance, the opponents in a presidential debate have a very different relationship with each other than two high school students duking it out for a plastic trophy at Barnwell.
There's some wood too.
The relationship between the speakers and the audience is very different. So in policy debate in high school, the audience is a few middle-aged judges, probably some parents that got recruited, whereas the audience for the presidential debate is global, and there's a lot of media output that comes from the debate, etc. So essentially, these two forms of debate are quite different from each other. You can't say that they're the same thing. They have some phenomena that are overlapping, right? Like you would have two sides opposing each other. They're both basically competition. They're both for the benefit of an audience, right? Those are phenomena that they share, but in essence, they're different. So that's the way that a Marxist might distinguish between presidential debate and high school policy debate.
There's a surface level similarities, but that is as far as it goes.
So a big part of understanding the concept of debate is figuring out how to define all these various forms of debate and understand the underlying relationships. So we can look at the history of debate, look at how debate manifests today under capitalism, all the different various forms that it takes, and try to sort through when communists should resort to debate, when it's a useful tool to put in the toolbox, and what forms of debate would be useful for communists, and when we should walk away from the debate podium, and even when it might be harmful to our movement. So those are the things that we're going to be covering today here on NonCompete. Okay, dear audience, I'm now going to throw some words at you that are big and scary and nerdy. So fear not. We will shepherd you through this experience, and you will come out unscathed on the other side. We have to consider here epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that is concerned with how we know what we know. We're also going to be talking a little bit about ontology, the branch of philosophy that is concerned with how we know what is real.
Maybe even with evidence.
What this really boils down to in the great pantheon of ideologies is idealism versus materialism. Remember, we call our philosophy as Marxists dialectical materialism. What does that mean, and how is that distinguished from idealism? To put it very simply, and if you want to learn a lot more, this book goes really into detail on it. Remember, it's free at banyanhouse.org/shop. Idealism is the belief that human consciousness drives existence and truth can be found in the realm of ideas. And in fact, argumentation and debate and rhetoric are the key tools of discovery of truth to the idealist. You can contrast that with materialism. Materialists believe that the material world is the first basis of reality, the source of knowledge and truth. And they look for truth by examining the material world. Dialectical materialism is a little bit different from every other form of materialism because it has synthesized aspects of human consciousness, aka ideology, the ideal, into its philosophical methodology. Pop quiz, Slop.
Okay.
What is the relationship between matter and consciousness, the material world, and ideology in the framework of dialectical materialism?
The material determines consciousness, and the consciousness affects material.
The material determines everything. If I want ice cream right now, I can't think it into existence, right? I can't do that through pure consciousness. I can impact the world through my conscious human activity, through my labor activity. I can stand up, go to my freezer, get some ice cream that somebody made, right? But all that stuff has to materially be possible first. So we don't completely dismiss ideology and consciousness and ideas. We recognize that ideas can have even objective impact in the real world. So for instance, like racism is an ideological construct. It doesn't have any basis in material reality because race doesn't truly exist in a material sense. But we know that racism has objective impact on the world and on humans in their lives, right? So that's how we reckon with this question of the material versus the ideal. But idealists and most bourgeois, liberal, metaphysical philosophy that you will encounter in the West is, at the end of the day, idealist in nature. Idealists believe the first most important thing in reality is human consciousness and ideas. And idealists think that debate is super important. Arguing with each other is super important because it is through this process of testing ideas against one another that the best ideas are the cream that come to the top. And we skim off those ideas.
What they miss is that the analysis in total is incomplete. Yes, ideas can shape other ideas, but the material impact is not happening during that idea generation. Ideas do shape other ideas, but there still has to be some kind of like material thing. There has to be some kind of interaction, some kind of contradiction that happens in the material world in order for that to be meaningful.
You're correct that, of course, you can present an idea and then I present a counter idea, and we could do that forever. But the more we do that, the farther and farther we're getting away from the real world, and we're getting deeper and deeper into absurd hypothetical and abstraction territory. So the point is, we at some point in the idea generation process, we have to test the ideas against reality in the material world. If you're just spending all your time in the realm of ideas, you have no feedback as to when you've gone off track. You could be completely out in the weeds and not even realize it because you haven't gone back to test your ideas in the material world. And especially with a subject like politics, that's very important because if you spend all this time ideating and planning and coming up with all kinds of political theory, but you never go back to the real world and test those ideas, you're literally just fantasizing at that point. And it's a useless, perhaps even harmful process. That's something that my mentor used to say all the time is like, there are people in this world who think that meetings are work. And those are like the worst people to work with. Meetings have a crucial role to play. Like we have to come together and discuss things and plan things and everything, but that's not the work. And that's exactly what the spectacle is all about, is passive participation in politics, where you get the sort of dopamine hit, you get the feeling that you're doing something that matters, whether it's through debating or watching a debate or watching spectacle or what have you, without actually actively participating in the real world. And that's what's so dangerous about idealism and spectacle, is that it derails the movement and it deactivates people. And I think that deactivating the working class has been the project of the ruling class for centuries now. They just want to neutralize us by having us engage in all of this appearance of activity, which is why I think that some people think that meetings are work. Some people think that debate is the work of politics. It just doesn't have that application or utility. And at worst, it's doing real harm because it's pushing people into this idealist realm where they are so far removed from practical activity. It's like Fred Hampton said, at some point you just have to do something and find out if you made a mistake or not. And if you make a mistake, as Fred Hampton said, that's a good thing. It means you've learned not to do that. Try something else now. It's a process of trial and error is way more effective than the process of talk and debate. What struck me about the Kamala Harris-Donald Trump debate was that it really illustrates the purpose of spectacle debate, because while we are arguing that spectacle debate, whether you're talking about televised debate or online debate, does not serve the purpose that it portends to solve, it does serve a purpose. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the purposes of spectacle debate, and I think that can help us understand whether or not it's something communists should participate in. The first purpose, I think, would be, in a debate like presidential debate especially, would be manufacturing consent.
Well, we saw it on full display in this most recent debate too. Harris was repeating the lie that there was these mass rapes of people on October 7th. I think she even said that babies were murdered, and it's a further cause for both sides to continue building their war machine, or to at least let things keep going as they are now, which is absolutely a genocide.
Immigration is another great example. Michael Parenti talks about this a lot in Inventing Reality. You can live with the illusion that you disagree with one side or the other side, but you're still kind of put into this perceptual box where you have to pick one of the sides that are presented to you. And I think that, yes, the genocide in Israel and immigration were both topics where the Overton window was very concretely defined for us, that immigrants are not your comrades. They're not part of the working class. You shouldn't have any sympathy or solidarity with them, from both the perspective of Harris and from the perspective of Trump. And then the question really is just, should we dehumanize them more like Trump or less, but still dehumanize them like Harris? Of course, with Israel, it's the same thing. They're both going to justify Israel's occupation and genocide of Palestine. And it's really just a matter of which aesthetic you vibe with more from the two that are presented as options. So yeah, that's certainly consent manufacturing and reality inventing process going on there, a propagandistic purpose.
The next part too is that the Democrats are constantly reaching towards Trump's audience, trying to win them over. Not only win them over, but really get them feeling like they're engaged in the process too. They finally have somebody to root for, even though they don't agree with everything she says. I don't really know what they're thinking, but between the comments about how she and Tim Walz own guns, how they want to make America the greatest military in the world, all of these are the number one killing machine, I think is what she said. It's all a blender in my brain at this point.
Ensuring we have the most lethal fighting force in the world.
Well, they're both stretching towards the right.
Right.
So whether it's Harris, who is stretching towards the kind of moderate, quote unquote, Republicans that Joe Biden has always been trying to basically pander to with his entire administration and his entire career and over the last few decades.
The late great John McCain.
He was an American hero. The late, great John McCain. John McCain, he loved our country. He was so courageous.
This is a monument to commemorate the capture of John McCain in 1967. So just look at the monument itself.
It says U.S., see, and it has a star on it.
Kamala Harris. See that it's falling?
Kamala Harris put flowers on this monument.
I'm sorry, Kamala Harris, but this is a monument to commemorate the capture of John McCain and to praise the farmers who capture him here in this behind this monument.
Or whether you're talking about Trump stretching to the right to overt open Nazis with his cat eating remarks and that sort of thing, which were obviously signals to that far right base he has.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
And I think that this speaks to why the format of debate is so antagonistic to our ideals as communists. And I'm specifically talking about this kind of spectacle debate, because we as communists, we should be educating workers to think critically and resist things like sophistry. We're not here to steer the working class through sophistry. That's not the role of a communist. We should be activating workers to learn how to identify these kinds of tactics and the ways in which propaganda defines a sort of perceptual reality, as Parenti calls it. We shouldn't be using the tools of the bourgeoisie, which are used to mislead and deceive the working class. So this kind of spectacle debate is really all about building perceptual reality that develops false consciousness with workers. And that's part of the reason that idealists love debate so much. And part of the reason why the bourgeoisie loves idealism so much is because it makes it so easy to create a perceptual reality. If you're dealing in the realm of words and fantasy and human imagination, and you're not testing your ideas against reality, it's a lot easier to build false consciousness with workers. So, of course, the ruling class would want the working class to have an idealist concept of reality.
The material always determines the ideal. The material always determines what we can think of, how we think of things, and ultimately what we can do with those ideas back in the real world, right? Back in the material objective world. And also, those ideas wouldn't be generated without your brain matter. Even when you're generating ideas based on other ideas, you're doing it through material, electrochemical, biological processes, right? So that's really important to understand as we move forward, because as we look at the history of debate and how people engage with debate today, we have to understand that most debate that we see and the ways that people think about how ideas interact with each other and conflict and battle with one another is through an idealist lens. And that's a bad thing, according to Marx and Engels and everyone else that was right. A great example of the idealist framework for the pursuit of truth is something that Slop and I call the wooden egg argument. And this is something that actually happened when I was at Slop's house one day. In Slop's kitchen, there was an egg on a shelf. That is the very egg that I saw. I picked it up and I was looking at it and I said, is this a real egg? Like, was this like a real egg that they kind of cut a hole in and suck the yolk out and then decorate it? Or is this like an artificial wooden fake egg? And Slopstash, you didn't know the answer to that question. And we decided that we would be idealists and we would just argue about it. And whoever won the argument was right. And that's how we would determine whether or not it was a real egg or a wooden egg. That's how idealists see the world. They think that we find truth by sitting around talking about things, arguing about things, reasoning them with pure thoughts alone. But in reality, as dialectical materialists, we would not want to try to argue our way to discovery of whether or not that was an artificial egg. The only way we would be able to know if it was a real egg or not is to crack that sucker open. But we will not do that because we like the existence of a Schrodinger's egg.
We like the mystery and we like the egg. We will not crack it.
The idea that you can just argue and talk and debate about the nature of reality to find truth is silly. It's absurd. That's not to say that there's never a place for debate. And we're going to talk about when Marxists and communists and the working class should use debate. But idealist debate and the notion that we can uncover the ultimate important truths about reality through simply talking to each other and sharing our ideas back and forth with each other is absurd. We'll never know truth about wooden eggs or anything else without testing our ideas in the real world against objective reality. We want to avoid utopianism, and that is something that bogs down the working class all the time. Why don't you tell the people what utopianism is, in the Marxist perspective, Slop?
I think in the most basic sense, you can describe utopianism as describing the perfect end goal to a T where everything is solved.
Another way of thinking about it is it's like constructing a perfect society in our mind, idealistically, and then expecting reality to conform to that perfect ideal version of society that we created in our head. And Engels wrote a great piece, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, to try to distinguish between utopian conceptions of socialism and, dialectical materialist conceptions. The important thing to understand is that if we try to construct a perfect utopia in our head and just like plan it all out, this is exactly what we've got to do. First of all, that's a waste of time because it's going to take a lot of struggle to get to that society. And we're going to learn a lot of things along the way that's going to change your concept of what a perfect society might be. And second of all, we don't really know what's going to work and what's not until we test those ideas against reality. It's very, very important to understand that. So an idealist debate that I see unfold all the time in socialist circles is, would such and such exist under communism or not? Would a restaurant exist under communism? I think it's good to have visions of the future for like inspiration. But when we start to have animosity with each other, arguing and hating each other because we disagree about whether something will or won't exist in a future society that's probably generations away, it's a total waste of time. It drains energy from us. It's obnoxious.
It's over-indexing on something that is ultimately unknown because we're constantly in flux. We're constantly developing, like all of our relationships are changing and contradicting. So instead of trying to solve the problems of the future, we could more appropriately turn our attention towards problems of right now and things that we can do physically in the material world to actually make those changes.
Absolutely. That's a great way of putting it. And I think, it's fun to speculate about the future. And that's part of the problem with idealism is idealism can be very fun, and speculating about future conceptions of society is fun. But, another thing to realize is that once we do get rid of capitalism and we establish a stateless, classless society, that's not the end of development. It's not even the establishment of complete human emancipation. It's political emancipation, but it's really just step one towards human emancipation. And humanity will continue to develop and change, and hopefully for the better, for generations and generations to come. So maybe restaurants will exist 500 years from now and then not exist 1,000 years from now. And then maybe they'll come back 1,500 years from now. All we could do is guess. It's all we can do. And that can be fun. That could be a Trivial Pursuit. It's definitely more fun than the game Trivial Pursuit, which is the worst game. I don't know. Who likes Trivial Pursuit? Do you like Trivial Pursuit? Slap?
No. And also, what is your goal debating somebody on whether or not a restaurant will be an object in the future? Are you trying to convince them that we should do something now about it? Are you trying to convince them that they are just wrong, or that they are somehow misinformed?
They're not real communists.
Right. And so if that's the point, I don't know, is that worthwhile?
Well, the problem here is that there's a rabid infestation of the working class with bourgeois individualism and bourgeois attitudes about competition. And there's a lot of people who think of themselves as socialists and communists, and their primary concern is, as an individual, proving to everyone else that they know the most about communism and they have the best ideas about communism, and everyone else is a fake communist. That is unfortunately a very common mindset with Western communists, especially the sort, I hate to say it, that spend a little bit too much time on the internet. Instead of coming together with their fellow workers, coming together with their neighbors and their community and building a movement, they want to spend their time competing and attacking and tearing down their fellow communists. And a lot of these people, by the way, are probably bad actors. They're probably coming in as agent provocateurs. A lot of them are probably trolls, but certainly not all of them. And we need to fight against that attitude and that mindset as much as we can. Here's a quote from Engels that talks about, because I think this was a problem even back in his day, the problems with idealist utopian debate and the ways in which debate are abused in political circles. This is from Anti-Düring, which was written in 1877. He wrote, "This mode of outlook is essentially that of all English and French and of the first German socialists. Socialism is the expression of absolute truth, reason, and justice, and has only to be discovered to conquer all the world by virtue of its own power. And as absolute truth is independent of time, space, and of historical development of man," he's really attacking metaphysical thinking here, right? He's talking about this metaphysical way of looking at the world where we try to break everything up into these discrete, static categories that exist platonically in all time and space, right? That's not how the world actually works. So that's what he's attacking right here. But he's saying that, these socialists believe that it is a mere accident when and where this absolute truth of socialism is discovered. With all this absolute truth, reason, and justice are different with the founder of each different school. And as each one's special kind of absolute truth, reason, and justice is again conditioned by his subjective understanding, his conditions of existence, the measure of his knowledge, and his intellectual training, there is no other ending possible in this conflict of absolute truths than that they shall be mutually exclusive of one another. In other words, everyone's going to have their own idea of what a perfect stateless, classless society is going to be like. Everyone's going to have their own guesses, because that's all that they are, about what life will be like after we get rid of capitalism. And they're all going to conflict with each other in this idealistic battle of ideas in the free market of ideas, right? Hence, from this, nothing could come but a kind of eclectic, average socialism, which, as a matter of fact, has up to the present time dominated the minds of most of the socialist workers in France and England. Hence, a mishmash allowing of the most manifold shades of opinion, a mishmash of less striking critical statements, economic theories, pictures of future society by the founders of different sects, a mishmash which is the more easily brewed, the more the definite sharp edges of the individual constituents are rubbed down in the stream of debate like rounded pebbles in a brook. I really love this quote because, first of all, it identifies this problem of eclecticism, which is when you take all these different viewpoints, all these different perspectives, all these different philosophies, and you kind of mash them together. And that's what a lot of liberalists and people who call themselves leftists do. They're like, oh, I'll take a little bit of this ideology, I'll take a little bit of this ideology, and I'll make myself my own personal special ideology that's just for me, and it's better than all of your ideologies. But what Engels is saying is that when you do that, and when you have this purely idealistic way of trying to refine and improve ideas, where it's all happening divorced from material objective reality, what you're really doing is you're watering down those ideas, and you're just making them further and further away from material reality.
It's an apt metaphor. Basically, that like all of the ideas that had merit get sort of worn down and everything becomes homogeneous and uniform so that we don't even see those differences anymore. Oh, it's a homogenization.
Yeah, it's a homogenization through idealism because we're never testing our ideas against reality. So it's like we get farther and farther and farther away from where we want to go, which is material change in the real world. It's not actionable and it's not rooted in action. So what we need to strive to do, Engels says, is make a science of socialism and place it upon a real basis. And that means base our ideas in material reality, test our ideas with practice and with observation of history through historical materials practices, test our ideas against reality. And really, we're just talking about evidence-based science. That's all we're talking about. We're talking about, instead of saying like, I don't know, I think it is a real egg. No, I think it's a fake egg. No, it's a real egg. It's a fake egg. Like, that's not how we discover truth. We have to test our ideas against reality. We have to crack that son of a bitch open.
If you want to have an idealistic debate about an egg that you've never even seen in real life or held in person, be sure to do that in the comments.
Do you think the egg is real? Sound off in the comments. But be sure to show proper respect to the egg.
That's right.
The best way to learn about reality is through direct observation of reality and experiments and looking at how things have worked in the past and looking at history and what things have been effective and what hasn't been effective. But of course, understanding too that the material conditions today are different from what's in the past. These are all the kinds of things that Marxists are concerned with.
Right.
Observation of the material world and evidence.
No way! Prove it!
All that being said, we are not empiricists. Let me explain what an empiricist is. An empiricist is a kind of like vulgar materialist who thinks that we can only find truth through observation of the material world, and that consciousness has absolutely no use whatsoever. Marx and Engels were very critical of empiricists, okay? That doesn't mean that they were not fans of empirical data. Of course, they used empirical data, but they didn't want to completely dismiss the role of consciousness and human conscious activity in shaping and changing our world. An example of an empiricist was somebody like Hume. The way Hume saw things was like, okay, truth can only come from the material world, but we can't really trust our senses. Therefore, it's like impossible to find truth. It's like an overcorrection towards the material, and it gives no credit to our abilities as humans to find truth.
It's like a 6-year-old learning their colors and then stumbling upon the idea that, oh, maybe the red that I see isn't the red that everyone else sees. And then suddenly they have an existential...
Therefore, there's no truth.
There's no truth. Existential meltdown time.
Yeah, exactly. That was basically Hume's whole thing. So we don't want to go that far into pure materialism that completely abandons consciousness. And we also have to understand, because we know that everything relates to everything and everything's constantly changing and the world is very complex and capitalism is very complex and human society is very complex. Human beings as individuals are very complex. There's so much complexity that inevitably there are going to be times where opinions will emerge that differ from each other, even if they're rooted in material reality.
The only people we hate more than the Romans are the fucking Judean people.
So, for instance, we might disagree about which direction to take our political party.
The People's Front of Judea, splitters. We're the People's Front of Judea. Oh.
Or what kind of actions we should do in our community organization, or whether or not we should strike in a union. Those are valid questions that need to be sorted out and, frankly, debated and discussed between workers to find our way forward. So there are going to be times, many, many times, where debate is something that we're going to have to engage in. But the question is, what forms of debate do we engage with? And how do we relate to each other through that medium of debate? What distinguishes dialectical materialist debate from metaphysical idealist sorts of debate? And we're going to answer all of these questions and more. But first, we must, as Marxists, as dialectical materialists, we must establish a comprehensive and historical perspective. This is absolutely non-negotiable. We have to have a perspective, an analysis that is historical in nature, meaning that we look at where it came from, how it has developed over time, how it is developing and changing right now. We look at all of those different relationships that have driven that change. And it has to be comprehensive, meaning we look at it from every possible angle. We don't have a whole lot of time, so we can't really be truly comprehensive, but we're going to try to have a reasonably good survey of the history of debate in the Western world, mostly, because this is a critique of Western bourgeois society that we're doing right here in Western bourgeois forms of debate. So first, let's take a trip back to classical Greece.
Oh, great. My favorite.
Yes, Slopstash studied the classics in Rome.
What? No, hold on. I studied classics, not in Rome.
I never said you studied classics in Rome. Slopstash studied the classics in Rome.
Oh, well, then I misheard.
You misheard. Slopstash, you studied the classics in college, so I'm going to be leaning on you quite heavily for this section. But I do know that those ancient Greeks and Romans loved to debate. They loved oratory and rhetoric and logic and dialectics, but not like dialectical materialism dialectic, but like, I don't know. Where do we begin? I don't even know where to begin with this because there's so much to unpack.
So I did study classics, and I did study specifically ancient Greek, but my focus was not entirely on philosophy, but I did have to suffer through a class on Plato, and I did a final translation that was horrendous of Xenophon's Memorabilia. And I later, after college, did a reading group on another Platonic dialogue. But the Platonic dialogue that I read first in Greek was the Gorgias, or the Gorgias. Neither one is probably how they actually said it in Attic Greek. So the Gorgias starts off with Plato being addressed by the interlocutors in his midst. People would come up and say like, oh, I heard you say this. I don't think that's right. I think we should continue this discussion, either here on the street or, in my palace, basically.
So it's an accounting of a debate, right? That's kind of the idea.
Right. And so, these were set up as dialogues between typically just two people. There are people that come in and out of the conversation, but it's mostly a dialogue between two individuals, set up in exactly how you would sort of expect like a screenplay or something.
Were these more idealist in nature, or was there some material analysis going on in the Platonic dialogues?
There is like some material analysis that happens. I'm not a Plato scholar. I've read Plato, but I think Aristotle tends to venture more into the very metaphysical and very idealistic. Plato a lot of times tries to come up with examples, like very specific examples.
Like real world examples.
Exactly.
Like from objective reality, right?
But sometimes like they're not real world examples. But in the Gorgias specifically, where the entire premise is the school of sophists in general, which are people that were either paid to argue on behalf of somebody or to be taught how to speak. The sophists were people who had studied under Socrates and studied his methods of argumentation and picked out specific tools. They kind of standardized methods in order to misdirect a conversation or a discussion. So they were basically teaching people for money how to manipulate and change people's minds. And that's not maybe explicitly what it was for, but that is how it was sold and how it was accepted.
And today we use the term sophistry to describe forms of rhetoric and communication that are inherently dishonest, cynical, win the debate, quote unquote, in the eyes of the audience, win over an audience maybe, or influence an audience. You're not concerned at all with the truth or finding the actual solution to a problem.
Correct. That was always the goal. The goal was to win the argument, not to determine any kind of truth.
And Plato thought that was no bueno, right?
Right. No, he did not like that.
Basically, I guess what we could say about the ancient world is they thought that rhetoric and debate was important. They had things that are similar in some ways to what we have today, things like senates and public speaking and those sorts of things. Of course, their material conditions and their class society was far different than what we have today. So there were some phenomena that were shared between what we have now and what they had back then. But in essence, a lot of things have changed since then, right? We don't really have to go much deeper than that, but that's kind of one of the birthplaces of debate. Virtually every civilization has probably had some sort of emergence of debate and probably some sort of emergence of sophists, their version of sophists. So,
right. What we're critiquing now, though, there is a direct line between what's going on in what we see now and the sophists in ancient Greece.
And one of the reasons for that is the humanist period in the Renaissance, when European people were starting to engage with these classical ancient Greek and Roman texts, which, by the way, a lot of them they had on hand, as Slopstad has elucidated before on this point, because Arab people had translated them, copied them, preserved them, and transmitted them back to Europe, right? So that's one of the reasons they had all of this material on hand.
Yeah, we really do need to do a whole discussion on the transmission of knowledge through the Dark Ages.
So European people rediscovered, I guess you could say, a lot of these classical ideas, but then they repurposed them. And unlike the ancient Greeks, one of the main reasons that medieval and Renaissance Europeans became interested in debate was to defend the great religion of Christianity against basically doubts about Christianity. But there was a very formalized form of debate which emerged from this, which was called the disputation. And disputations were formalized, public, forced debates in which Christian religious leaders would force Jewish people to debate them. Kings and nobles would get involved with these things and organize them and facilitate them, and again, force the Jewish people into doing this against their will. In fact, there are many cases where the Jewish people didn't want to participate because they didn't want to rock the boat and create ill will with the Christian people who ruled the land. But the Christian kings and nobles and religious leaders would force them to do it anyway. This happened in many different countries at many different times. But of course, it would always end with the Christian kings and the Christian religious leaders declaring themselves the winners. And I think there's a lesson in this, first of all, for sort of the DNA and the pedigree of debate in Europe and Western society. I mean, that's kind of a really kind of disgusting way to manifest the concept of debate, right? Like when you're taking people who are marginalized, they are definitely a minority, definitely persecuted, and you're forcing them to come and debate with you so that you can have this kangaroo court and performatively declare yourself the winner. But also, there is a lesson here about historical materialism. There is a second book coming out, which is the sequel to this book, which is going to cover historical materialism in great detail. But for now, let me just say that historical materialism is the application of dialectical materialism to the analysis of human history. And one of the great principles that Marx and Engels discovered about history is that we should not study the ideas of people from the past in and of themselves. In other words, before Marx and Engels, when people studied history, they would look at the ideology of past forms of society. They would look at the ideology of the feudalists. They would look at the ideology of the ancient Greeks or whatever in and of itself in this kind of isolated way. And we would think that we could gather truth about the past from just looking at those ideas. Marx and Engels said, no way, you have to look at the material conditions from which those ideas emerged, because the prevailing ideas of any period of time are the ideas of the ruling class during that period of time. And this is a perfect example. This is a situation where Christianity and Christian kings and nobles were the feudal lords, literally, of this society. And they were basically forcing these debates to happen and then declaring themselves the winners. And then that's what gets written down in the historical record. So you can't look at that and say that it was like a fair contest. You can't look at that and say that Jewish people got a fair shake at all in those debates. That's another reason why debate in and of itself, purely focused in the ideal is useless, because if we're historical materialists, we have to look at the material conditions that underlie the ideas and generate those discussions.
Yeah, so I think this is a really good example of spectacle debate, which is a form of debate where you're not trying to come to any kind of truth or decide on something. It is purely for the sake of the person putting it on or the person who is intended to win. It's propaganda, obviously.
I think you're absolutely right. And the whole point of disputations was to reassure the Christian peasants and such that Christianity was the one good faith, and to justify their own position of power and privilege, because, they said that, oh, I'm the king because God said I'm the king. I have this divine right to rule. Absolutely. It's a great observation that this was an early form of spectacle debate. This formalization of debate continued, and by the 1600s in Europe, formal debate societies began to emerge, and also parliaments in various places in Europe were becoming more and more of a part of the fabric of the government of society. And we also started to see the emergence of things like Robert's Rules of Order, which would facilitate debate and discussion with things like parliaments and committees and that sort of thing. In the 17 and 1800s, you started to see political debates become a huge part of the structure of governance in the United States of America, this new liberal democracy. And the founding fathers, of course, had a very famous series of debates at the Constitutional Convention, where they wrote the Constitution and they all debated each other about what should and shouldn't go in. And, they had a lot of great conclusions to that debate, like the fact that enslaved Black people were only 3/4 of people, and that slavery should continue, and that only white male landowning people should be able to vote. They had all kinds of debates and made all kinds of decisions like that.
Very virtuous debates, very virtuous.
Yes, they had a lot of virtue and honor, as Aristotle would say. Yeah, so debate became something that Americans really took to heart. There were a lot of famous debates in the 1700s and 1800s. There was the very famous Lincoln-Douglas debate. So in that debate, Abraham Lincoln debated a very famous, some might say sophist, named Stephen Douglas, who was very well known in his time and respected for being able to just bullshit and twist words and manipulate and use rhetorical trickery to win debates. Maybe not find the truth, maybe not be correct, maybe not be right, but win the debate.
Des affirmations inconciliables se poussent sur la scène du spectacle unifié de l'économie abondante.
Let's talk about a person named Guy Debord, who wrote a book called Society of the Spectacle in 1967. Debord was a Marxist, and he argued that social life in bourgeois civil society, in the culture of places like the USA and capitalist Europe, social life was replaced with representation of social life. And people were only granted the illusion of participation in society. And all of this was cultivated by the ruling class. And this draws from some things that are reminiscent of things that Antonio Gramsci wrote, who was an Italian communist. Basically, the idea that Debord presented was that you, as a worker in modern capitalism in the 1960s, don't really have a role in society anymore. You don't have a voice anymore in any meaningful way. You don't have community with your fellow citizens. You don't have a place at the table when it comes to governing or even participating in society. All of this has been replaced with what Debord calls the society of the spectacle. The way he put it was, you have passive identification with the spectacle. In other words, it becomes part of your identity in a passive way. So workers are mistaking this passive participation in things like electoral politics. They're not actively participating. They're not taking an active role in controlling what happens in society. Capitalists do all that. The bourgeois class does all that. They pay politicians off. They own the politicians. They are the politicians. They govern society. And then workers just play this role where they're basically performing a role just like an actor would in a stage play. And you could think of electoral politics as a great example of this. It's like, I'm Team Republican. I hate Democrats. I'm Team Democrat. I hate Republicans. Workers have come to feel like just assuming that identity of one political party or the other, maybe even arguing with your family members at Thanksgiving about politics, that has replaced actual political action and activity for the vast majority of workers in bourgeois civil society. This is important, I think, for the discussion because, for one thing, the society of the spectacle is like exactly what Engels was talking about like polishing the pebbles through idealist debate. It's a form of deeply ingrained idealism where we, the workers, are trained and conditioned and manipulated by capitalists to believe that passive observation and engagement with ideas alone and with identity components that we take from society will somehow change our lives or improve our lives or something like that. If we vote for this person, and if we support this person, and if we identify with this group, and if we support the home team, and we're good Americans and we show up at the parades, then life will be better for everybody.
I imagine that it stems a lot from developing a heuristic, some sort of pathway for people to make decisions quickly when presented with more information than you probably know what to do with, right? So you can say, and I'm not defending this as legitimate, but this is probably, I think, where it stems from is that you've got a working class that does see a lot of futility in what they do. They think that if they can count the number of people that agree with them who also agree with this other person, then their side's winning. That they don't have to worry about all of the action that they have to take personally and communally with everyone else. And that's a much easier path than actually putting in the work.
This is something that Gramsci talked about a lot. Workers are tired, exhausted, don't have a lot of free time, don't have a lot of energy, and don't have a lot of room to navigate performing actual action. And we don't have a lot of venues and vehicles to do it that used to exist. For instance, there aren't really prominent socialist communist parties anymore. There used to be, every major city would have communist youth halls and gathering spaces that were owned by parties where workers could come together and socialize and share ideas and plan activities and that sort of thing. Union halls used to be a really big thing. Now they're a lot more rare than they used to be. So workers don't have the material basis or the time, the material conditions to act anymore. It makes us feel a little bit better to feel like we're doing something, even if it's just this passive relationship that's almost like supporting a sports team. I voted, I defended Harris at the dinner table at Christmas, and I'm done. That's all I got. It's unfortunate, but it's how we've been conditioned to operate politically as a class.
I think this just gets further developed through the 60s and 70s and 80s, and of course rapidly develops with the age of the internet. But you can see it in the Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley debate that became so famous. It's just two nominally very intelligent public intellectuals having some kind of sparring match verbally.
If you can express any point of view you want. Shut up a minute.
Where they don't actually answer anything that would satisfy the opponent's audience, at least. I think both of the audiences came away thinking, oh, our guy won. Meanwhile, the entire debate was just strewn with ad hominem attacks or, just not answering the previous person's question and using some level of, again, sophistry to renegotiate what the debate is even about.
I confess that anything complicated confuses Mr. Vidal.
What we're seeing is the emergence of television as a medium. And it's like Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. Television kind of changed the game. It presents a new way for spectacle to be mass delivered to all of society. And this is also the time when we start to see televised debates. The first televised debate was in 1960, which was Kennedy versus Richard Nixon. And what's really remarkable about that debate is the fact that Nixon did not understand this new medium and Kennedy did. So Kennedy was kind of like a younger person, perceived as kind of more hip with it, cool cat daddy-o. Nixon was a bit more of like an old school patrician kind of politician. And Nixon refused to wear makeup. So he has this haggard appearance. He wore a suit that blended in with the background, whereas Kennedy had a suit that was darker and offered some really good contrast. So he stood out nice and sharp on the black and white television screen. And Kennedy just seemed overall more prepared for this medium of debate, both aesthetically and in terms of how he presented his ideas. And Nixon didn't get it. And so, a lot of people say that had a lot to do with why Kennedy won.
Well, no reflection, Mr. Smith, upon your first debate, which I remember very well, between Kennedy and Nixon. But I think these great debates are absolutely nonsense. The way they're set up, there's almost no interchange of ideas, very little even of personality. If we remember, everybody decided that Nixon looked rather disagreeable, that Kennedy didn't look as young as they'd been told. He looked much solider. He seemed to have a nicer smile. It was much more, it's too frivolous. There's also the terrible thing about this medium that hardly anyone listens. They sort of get an impression of somebody, and they think that they figure out just what he's like by seeing him on television. This would mean that you might have the most disastrous man in the country who happened to be a good television performer, and he could beat let us say, Senator Taft, a virtuous man of no great telegenic charm. So all in all, if I may, I hate to suddenly come out against the idea of debate in our lives, but the way they are now set up on television, I don't think I'd even bother to watch this one.
You start to see that these spectacular elements become very important in debate. What kind of suit you're wearing, how you speak, because you want to speak a little bit differently to a television audience than you would to like a huge crowd in a live event.
The people on television say my dog was taken and used for food.
So television creates this new way to implant messaging into people's heads, into the heads of the working class. It's a great new medium for propaganda. I would say that that first televised debate was a quality shift in presidential debates. The essence of what it meant for two presidential candidates to debate each other in a public venue changed drastically with the medium of television. And it became much more of a spectacle. When you're talking about spectacle debates, the debate itself is not the primary propaganda vehicle. And that's true with internet debates today. It's as true now as it was back then. The clips that they take from the debates, the sound bites, the narrative gets built around the debate. And that's more important than the debate itself.
There you go again.
Such a nasty woman.
I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
We know that with the debate we just had, Biden versus Trump in 2024, spectacle was what mattered in that debate. And it's incredible because Trump did not actually perform well. He was like a rambling fascist. Biden was just like a little bit more tired and kind of sickly, I guess.
You know, I watched it like maybe a day or two later, and I had heard a bunch of people's thoughts on it already. It was maddening to watch it and then just think like, what did y'all expect? I didn't think that Biden did particularly badly, but like that was all the messaging that came out immediately after that. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. It wasn't as bad as I was expecting it to be. But yeah, he was, tired or whatever. And that's what we take away from the debate is that he was tired. And then, he drops out of the race soon after that.
Nobody talks about what they actually said, the policies, the facts. Trump lied his ass off throughout the whole thing. And there were some attempts to fact check and that sort of thing, but that's not what was like the main thing everyone paid attention to. It was the spectacle.
Well, and that's the whole thing. It's like, you know what I remember from the Clinton debate with Dole and Ross Perot? I'm all ears.
If there's a fairer way, I'm all ears.
That was the soundbite.
It's the sound bites that get generated. It's all the media surrounding the debate. And that's as true with like online debate culture as it is with televised debate. And that brings us to our contemporary era of online spectacle debate and what we call argumentalism, which is just this political belief that the fundamental key core way to affect political change in society is to debate your political opponents on Twitch streams. It's a belief that the best positions will win in the free market of ideas, and that you can destroy someone with facts and logic, and you can like hashtag change my mind. All the memes surrounding debate culture. So the Steven Crowders of the world, the Ben Shapiro's of the world, this didn't come out of nowhere. Of course, there's been televised debate shows for a long time.
Of course, we are not concerned with the increase in the total population from, say, 55 to 60 million. Mm-hmm. We are concerned with the increase in an element of a population which is profoundly different, thinks itself different, is seen as different from the rest.
Crossfire,
Bill O'Reilly,
Sean Hannity, freaking Bill Maher. So there's all these like debate chat shows out there.
A big difference between online debate and those televised cable daily shows is that the audience directly interacts with the participants in a way that is not similar.
Not only that, but they build these spaces. Like if someone's debating a fascist, you're entering a space with that fascist person's audience. And you're basically exposing yourself virtually, but you're exposing yourself to fascist people. One thing we know as dialectical materialists is that you cannot impact something without it impacting you. And if I have an audience and I go and I welcome a fascist onto my show and they bring all of their fascist audience into my audience, first of all, me, by having this kind of like cozy business relationship with the fascists, which is what that is. I mean, at the end of the day, most of these debate people are making money. This is a business relationship. There's impact happening, mutual impact. And the fascists are going to take advantage of that and leverage it, because fascism is, if nothing, a very highly developed form of sophistry. Fascists don't have coherent positions. They don't really care if what they're saying today lines up with what they said yesterday or tomorrow. They'll change their entire rhetorical pattern to suit whatever
point they're trying to make
at this moment.
Right,
exactly. If you're an audience member to this kind of debate and you're just passively participating in it, maybe you chat a little bit, maybe you donate someone Patreon or whatever. That's the extent of your participation in politics. But it makes you feel like you're having this rich, fulfilling political life, when in fact, you're really just very passively engaging with the spectacle.
Yeah, you're providing impact, but it's not the right kind. The impact is if you give them money, then they feel motivated to continue doing it.
Yeah, they're mistaking this passive participation, watching a debate, siding with one side or the other, as political activity.
Arguing with people in the comments.
That's why we call it argumentalism. They think that if they just argue and argue and argue hard enough, that they will change the world. And I have to admit, I had that perspective for a long, long time, that if I could just find the right combination of words, I could convince somebody something and change their behavior or whatever. I think it's something that, especially in the West, people who are raised as males have this kind of toxic masculine notion that we can just get whatever we want through rhetoric and debate and arguing and forcing our perspective on other people. Really, what we should be doing as workers is trying to seek common ground and unite the working class, not with fascists, not seeking common ground with fascists, which is an inevitable result of debating fascists, but no, with our fellow workers who are actually struggling for a better world. We should find common ground and synthesize our ideas and find solutions to the material problems that we're facing, right? That should be the main focus of our activities. If we're putting all this emphasis on just arguing with people that we disagree with, we're not getting any activity done in the real world, in the material objective world. And the other thing about these debates is that really the primary skill that's on display is sophistry, because it's all building spectacle and encouraging passive participation in politics instead of taking an active role in a material sphere where you could actually affect change in the real world. And if you're presenting this in such a manner that you're showing your audience that it's worth listening to what these fascists have to say, we should, quote unquote, hear both sides or whatever. That is not the relationship that the working class should have with fascism, right? The relationship that we should have with fascism is we smash fascism, we silence fascists, we shut down fascists from speaking. That's what our priority should be. That's the whole point of Antifa, anti-fascism. And also, I'd like to say, why would we want to prioritize fascists so much? It takes a whole lot of effort to convert one fascist in truth.
Are you trying to suggest, EJ, that you can't just prove them wrong and they'll accept it? That's wild.
Well, if you look at the studies, look at psychological studies and look at what actually influences and persuades people, being combative and being aggressive and that sort of thing, according to the studies that I've looked at, it could potentially sway people who already agree with you to like you more, but it's much more likely to make people who disagree with you be more defensive. Intense language may be effective at enhancing enthusiasm among supporters, but ineffective at persuading those with contrasting views. That comes from a study on what actually influences people. The fascists, they don't care about truth. If they did, they wouldn't be fascists. They get into the business of being fascists because they don't care about objective truth and facts and building a better world. They get into fascism because they want power for themselves, because they enjoy being cruel. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and try to understand what makes a fascist, but it's certainly not that they care about the truth.
Yeah, and we know that fascism is directly opposed to everything that we want. So it doesn't seem like
to the extent that they want us dead. They want us dead. You cannot have a good faith conversation with a person who wants you dead. They know that, and they're going to leverage it, and they're going to play whatever tricks they possibly can to build their, cachet with their audience. To me, it's a very weird basis for like a political movement, is that, okay, well, here's our plan. We don't like fascism, right? Okay, all right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk to a bunch of fascists, and we're going to argue with them every week, establish long-term business relationships with them. It's an absurd notion. At the end of the day, the problem with spectacle debate, beyond the fact that it exists primarily to benefit the people who are organizing the debate financially and politically, et cetera, it's that form of debate is very idealist, because the whole conceit of spectacle debate is that the best ideas will win and those ideas will move society forward. It posits that truth can be discovered by simply talking about things and arguing about things and reasoning about things. These debate forms are tied up with the concept of victory and the belief that we can win through debate, through things like sophistry and rhetorical tricks and that sort of thing. We have to resort to those because, if it's true that ideas are what push humanity forward, then we have to win at all costs, right? So then it's a justification for sophistry. And there's this belief that like persuasion is key and paramount over evidence-based proofs and discoveries. In other words, if we have a problem, a real problem that we have to solve, we'll solve it by me having the idea that wins, not by testing the idea against reality. Like say you and me are driving along the road and the car breaks down in the middle of the desert and we don't know what to do. Now, we could sit there and argue all day and all night and into the next day. We'll die of thirst before arguing accomplishes anything. At some point, we have to try something. We have to do something. That is not something that debate can accomplish. In other words, debate can't accomplish anything at all in the material world. It's just a pure idealist arena for people to deceive their audiences into passively participating in politics instead of going out and doing something in the real world.
I don't think in any of the online debates I've seen that there were action items assigned at the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, imagine Steven Crowder like ending a debate and being like, all right. I mean, he might say like, subscribe to my Patreon or whatever the hell, or, donate or buy a shirt or something like that. That's the kinds of call to action that you're going to get. We try to say in every episode of this program on NonCompete that go out and organize with your neighbors, build a union at your workplace, build relationships with your fellow workers in the real world and solve those problems in the real world. We are dialectical materialists. If we're going to be having these like discussions and debates and that sort of thing, they should be rooted in the material conditions of the working class. And they should start from the perspective of the working class and the problems that the working class faces. And really also, we should not be individualists. Debate, online debate, spectacle debate is so individualistic. It's like professional wrestling. Here's the face, here's the heel. This is the good guy, this is the bad guy. And my individual hero is going to win. And it's like the great man theory of history that this one individual can go forward and win with facts and logic in this free market of ideas. That's not how workers should be building a movement. As communists, we should be building a collective movement that is democratic. Idealist debate is not useful for understanding the material or for solving material problems. You can observe the material and prove whether something exists in a certain matter or not. You cannot prove it by having a wooden egg debate where you talk all day and all night about whether or not the egg is made of wood.
So what is to be done?
What is to be done? Well, hopefully by now we all understand that idealism and idealist forms of debate and spectacle debate, all bad news for the working class. They're not particularly helpful or productive and often counterproductive. So let's talk about when communists might want to debate or might need to debate with each other and have a clash of ideas. Sometimes things are really complicated, or sometimes we just don't have the data from observation in the material world to answer a question. The only arguments that we should be concerned with as Marxists are the ones that pertain to our practical activities in the real world and what will and won't work in bringing about communism. Remember, the perspective of dialectical materialism is the perspective of the working class, and everything that we do as communists is in the service of communist revolution and ending class society, building a working class revolution. So when we are debating over material phenomena and objective reality, we have to have material investigation and material evidence, right? We have to test our ideas against reality. If we want to build a framework for like Marxist debate, that's very important, is that it's evidence-based, it's grounded in reality, and that we come up with mechanisms to test the ideas that are produced in debate against reality. So when will we actually debate? We'll finally answer that question. It's when you have an organization, a movement that has been established, and you need to make decisions. And sometimes you're going to have to hash out which direction to go in. That's like a baseline for when you might want to participate in debate with your comrades. The first thing we should say is like, what should be avoided? Debating fascists obviously should always be avoided. That doesn't mean that we never challenge fascist ideas or debunk fascist ideas or create agitprop that attacks fascism. Of course, we can do all of those things, but we can do that without platforming and tit for tatting and having slap fights with fascists like on the internet or in real life. You must not be abusive, confrontational, adversarial. We're not enemies. We're on the same team. We all have the same goal. So we don't want to see our fellow workers as enemies, even when they're misinformed and misguided by bourgeois propaganda, and most of them will be. You have to have proletarian piety. This is a concept that Ho Chi Minh came up with. Proletarian piety just means we love the working class. We respect the working class. We want to march side by side with our fellow workers. And everything that we do is in service to the workers. We don't see ourselves as above our fellow workers. Just because maybe we know more right now about communism, we have more class consciousness, we're further along that path at this moment than they are. That doesn't put us on a pedestal above them. They are the most crucial part of building a revolution, are our fellow workers. And if they're misguided, we come to them with compassion and we find ways to guide them side by side as equals. We don't preach down to them from on high like we're superior to them, which is the adversarial debate bro mindset. I have the superior ideas. I will crush you with my facts and logic. That's just going to alienate you even further from your coworkers that you're already alienated from. I have some advice from Ho Chi Minh on rhetoric and how to relate with your fellow workers. This is from something that Ho Chi Minh wrote in 1947 called Changing the Working Style, and basically like changing the working style of the Communist Party. Ho Chi Minh wrote, "One must learn how to speak the voice of the masses, must be practical, speak with evidence, and report with evidence. After finishing writing, one must read it over and over again. If one sees anything redundant, any sentence or word that is redundant, then remove it. Is reading it over and over again 4 or 5 times enough? Not enough. Read it over and over again. Edit it over and over again. I have read it several times and it is still not enough. I must ask some comrades, workers, farmers, and soldiers to read it again." That's really key. Get your fellow workers involved in that creative process with you.
Yeah. It's funny, just the way he frames it too, because when you're trying to communicate to people, make sure that you write it carefully and thoughtfully, and then revise it, and then have your fellow comrades read it and make sure they revise and put input on it as well. And you basically, at that point, just spread the message.
Spread it and improved it at the same time. We want to have this dialectical relationship with our fellow workers. Even if you know more about communism and you're more class conscious than your fellow worker, they might know something that you don't know that advances your understanding of the working class and of our movement. The wisdom of the masses is an incredible thing. You just have to understand how to tap into it and how to engage with your fellow workers and break down those barriers of alienation. But I think what's really important here too is that Ho Chi Minh clearly values taking great care in how we present our messaging. We don't just go off the cuff, and we certainly don't get engaged in mindless spectacle and passive engagement with politics. We want to be really active, and we want to be really careful about how we craft our messaging and our propaganda and our rhetoric. Even Marx and Engels did, I guess you could say, debate with contemporary thinkers, but they laid out responses very carefully with great care. If you read something like Anti-Düring or Response to the Gotha Program, these kinds of responses to bad ideas, the German ideology, these were works that Marx and Engels took great care in crafting. And they certainly weren't just throwing out ideas just to win, like as sophists. They were really trying to find truth. And they didn't just talk and argue, they did. They acted, they organized and built with their fellow workers. They traveled all over Europe to meet with and work with their fellow workers to build a real revolutionary movement.
It wasn't, done for the purpose of spectacle. It was done very thoughtfully in a way that they were able to actually do what a lot of the online debate community can't do, which is like go in and like actually fact check claims or provide evidence that is sufficient and compelling to the argument otherwise.
100%. And like people like Ho Chi Minh, yeah, he attacked the positions of his political opponents and fascists and imperialists, but he didn't like argue with them on TV. He didn't go and have like a big debate with Nixon, right? or
could you imagine?
Kissinger or whatever. I know. And then if you look at people like the Black Panthers, arguably the most successful communists in American history, they weren't spending their time arguing with fascists. They were organizing their communities. They were building community programs. They were feeding children. They were organizing cop watches. They were teaching people community self-defense. We have to look at what has worked in the past to build an actual organized movement. Look at what the Vietnamese did during World War II when the Japanese fascists were occupying Vietnam and starving the Vietnamese people. Vietnamese communists would go and they would like raid the food stores that the Japanese fascists had stolen from the Vietnamese people, and they would distribute it to the workers. And that built a lot of love where the workers came to trust and rely on the communists to solve their material problems. And this is something that I call material propaganda, where it's like If the people in your community are having some kind of problem, suffering, if there's some kind of issue facing them, and the communists are the ones that show up and help solve that problem, that is going to influence them far more than any words ever could.
Well, and I think another thing to keep in mind too is that when you're looking at the past for things that did work, also look at the things that didn't work and why. Sometimes, the things that worked in the past too, like wouldn't work now because of how the world has developed, how technology has developed. But there are some things that didn't work in the past that could work now because technology has also developed. But it's just something that I think to constantly keep in mind.
That's the science of historical materialism, is being able to look at the past, understand how development processes work, understand how things have changed since the past, and figure out what you can and can't maybe learn from history that could be applicable to today. That's how Marx and Engels were able to take history and turn it into an applicable, actionable science. I think the most important thing to remember is we should not be acting as individuals. Don't act alone. Find comrades to work with, to organize with, to build with. Debate will have a role in your organization, but they should be dialectical, materialist, evidence-based debates. And really, what's the end result? What's the end goal of a debate with communists? It's to find some kind of actionable idea that you can put to the test in reality. If you're at work with your fellow workers and you're building a union and the boss wants everybody to start working an extra hour every week without pay or something like that, you'll have to debate. You'll have to come up with different kinds of solutions. Should we go on strike? Should we write a letter? Should we do this? Should we sue? Whatever.
Yeah, if the ultimate goal of your reason for getting in the debate is to prove somebody wrong, without any other sort of material end goal, that's not what we do. You should not do that.
We don't act out of ego like that. We're not individualists. We're not here to try to just like win one over or one up our fellow workers. The debates that we have should be focused on material activities that we can perform and try in the real world. And like Fred Hampton said, we're going to fail. And that's good because we're going to learn from the failure. That is how Marxists advance in the world. Another reason why communists might want to debate is to come together more closely. Say you have two, like working class organizations. You have a workers union and you have another organization, whatever, and they want to work together, but they have certain disagreements about certain things, certain differences in perspective and point of view and that sort of thing. That's a good example of where debate might be useful. We can try to synthesize our ideas. And talking about those things and discussing them is healthy and good. I'm not discouraging people from even arguing or debating about things. The point is why are you doing it? Are you doing it because you want to win and you want to force your ideas on somebody else? Or are you doing it because you want to discover truth? If you want to discover truth and build a better working class movement, then you should be open to synthesizing your ideas with your fellow workers and listening to what other people have to say. Other people will have different experiences than you. Other people have walked different paths of life. And that's valuable information if you're all coming together in good faith. As actual work of building revolution and as it pertains to like meaningful debate, you want to make sure you have some kind of material, actionable outcome from your discussion. If you don't, what are you doing? What's the point? I'd like to talk really quickly about a format of debate that I find very interesting, which is the way that political debate, I guess you could call it, works in Vietnam. And I think what they've done is they've eliminated a lot of spectacle from political discourse between candidates in Vietnam. Luna, my partner and member of the NonCompete cooperative, has a great video on how elections work in Vietnam, where she actually went to an election and recorded a town hall meeting where candidates spoke. But basically the way it works is, first of all, political advertising in Vietnam is strictly illegal. You can't make Facebook posts. You can't put up posters. You can't do anything as a candidate. What they do is every ward, they call it a ward. It's like basically every neighborhood has a building, like a community building. And that building has like a bulletin board. And every candidate gets like one page on that bulletin board. I've seen them during election. That's the extent of advertising they can do. You can put your campaign policy there, whatever you want to put on that. You get that one page, more or less. There might be some variation from like ward to ward or district to district, but this is basically how it works. And then you cannot go on TV and do a stump speech. You can't have rallies or anything like that. What you can do is you can go to appointed meetings with the community that you want to represent. And the whole community is informed and invited to come to that. And they really do work hard to inform everybody. Like in our neighborhood, there's an old guy who comes and tells Luna during the last election, there's going to be this meeting. You really need to go there. We really want you to come and see these candidates so you know who to vote for, right? Like they really try to encourage people to vote and know who they're voting for. Luna goes to this meeting, and here are the ground rules for how the candidates are allowed to present themselves. Every candidate gets equal time. The candidates can address the audience. They are asked questions by the audience who are just like regular citizens. And they can only discuss policies and their policies or policies that they don't like or whatever. They may not attack other candidates at all. That's forbidden. If they start acting in bad faith, if they start attacking another candidate or whatever, they're cut off. They're shut down. And Luna has I think it's amazing footage of one of these meetings where somebody's like complaining about where the train station is in Da Nang. Like it's kind of like not good urban design where it is. And, it's just very vocal about, we don't like this and we want to change this and blah, 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 blah.
It is a great clip.
Yeah, it shows citizens engaging directly with these political candidates, and the spectacle aspect has been all but removed from it. Sure, yeah, the candidates are going to want to be charismatic, and they're going to probably want to have a few little jokes or something that they throw out, but they can't attack each other, and they don't have the opportunity to build these massive spectacle campaigns. They just don't have that opportunity at all. I think that's a kind of a cool, interesting debate format that communists use in Vietnam, but not only communists, because I think when Luna was voting, there were like 5 candidates, and I think only 2 or 3 of them were in the Communist Party. The other 2 or 3 were independent. So, and actually, the National Assembly in Vietnam has more independent members than, well, especially now. I think we just lost an independent member of Congress, didn't we? So the percentage of independent members that are non-Republican or Democrats in the USA is much lower than the percentage of independent candidates in Vietnam. Fun little fact. That's maybe some food for thought. Imagine if political election campaigns were like that in the USA, Slop. I mean, imagine it.
Yeah.
If they couldn't attack each other, if they couldn't have massive, expensive, capitalist-funded election campaigns, it's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around as a U.S. American, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, just the whole structure is just so different that it's very difficult to imagine its application
Our politics is completely mired in spectacle. That's all it is spectacle.
Yeah.
That's literally all it is. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this broadcast. If you like the ideas presented, read the book, subscribe to the channel, support us as you're able. But that's all we've got for now. I'm EJ.
I'm Slopstash. Don't follow me on any socials.
You can't follow me on any because I'm gone.
You're done.
I got rid of all that social media crap.
Good.
So yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching and take care of each other.